Welcome to the Ringer WNBA show, a very eventful 72 hours in the basketball universe, which makes me very excited to have our guest today, Andrew Haubner of No Cap Space. Diana Taurasi, in a sit-down interview with Sean Gregory, Times sports correspondent, has announced she's officially retiring from the WNBA. This is monumental news, crazy. Andrew. A titan of the league, perhaps the greatest player in the league's history. Certainly somebody whose competitiveness, whose self-expression, whose drive, whose personality has defined the WNBA. She was the WNBA. This is a league that's been operating for 28 years, and Diana Taurasi played in 20 of them. So I guess as a stenographer of WNBA history, of women's basketball history, what's on your mind right now?
Oh, man. Honestly, the complexity of wanting to respect the wishes of a Diana Taurasi with the broad feeling of what the league needs in terms of caretaking its own history, right? Because we did this exercise with Candace Parker already. Before I get there, because I feel like that's skunk at the garden party stuff, before I even do the macro meta stuff, I mean, truly one of the GOATs, if not the GOAT, depending on your persuasion, right? Greer Nganga, who's on our staff at No Cap Space, our resident UConn stan, DT, is her one and final and true GOAT. The amazing thing with DT and the crazy thing about, how we define greatest of all time, right? I think a lot of it's generational. I think there's era GOATs. I don't know if I like to get into the this era versus this era and have to battle the minutia. It's great for talk radio, but I think if we're actually adjudicating this stuff, you define it era by era. And DT, to me, I mean, the analog is LeBron, in so many different ways. The only real marked difference between the two of them was one was ordained coming out of high school, the other was preordained coming out of college. And yet, when we look at the longevity, the totality of their careers, what they were able to do, not just within the league, but within international play. And then you double up international play for Diana Taurasi when you factor in all of the EuroLeague play that she had over the course of her career. I mean, there is a very easy claim to be made that this is arguably the greatest player we've ever seen, but no doubt a starting five of the best players that have ever stepped into this league. I mean, this is seismic. And I can't understate how much this means to the WNBA, right? Because I feel like lately, within the last decade, we've had a lot of retirements that have been earlier than anticipated, right? Maya Moore leaves the league and goes to dedicate her life to social justice, which is an incredibly admirable cause, especially during the time period in which she really committed herself to doing that. But we haven't seen her in the league since, right? Candace Parker kind of quietly leaves a little bit maybe earlier than some people had expected. We get that first era of, the Cheryl Swoopses or the Cynthia Coopers, the Lisa Leslies retiring from this league, but we never really had a 20-year player that started in 97, for instance, and wrapped it in 2017. She is as much a living piece of WNBA history because, as you said, she's been in the league for almost as long as the thing has existed. And because of that, we have an entire body of work to look back on and say, you left the game better than you found it. You opened new doors and broadened new horizons for people, even like myself, right? I was a young kid growing up in Metro New York, and those UConn teams with DT and Sue and Swin Cash, they were on the cover of Sports Illustrated for Kids. The Journal News in Westchester was covering them. And everything culturally for us up in New York was, if you were a good women's basketball player in high school, you go to UConn. You don't go to Tennessee. You don't go to anywhere else. You go to play for Gina Auriemma and UConn. And a lot of that starts, to me, with DT in a lot of ways. That 2001 to 2005 stretch was really, I think, when UConn fully asserted itself. And you can't write that story without DT. And then you get to the WNBA. You can't write the Mercury story without DT. You can't write championship stories without DT. There's an argument that Brittany Griner doesn't have a ring without Diana Taurasi. And so every major component of what this history of women's basketball has been since the turn of the millennium. She is an indelible part of it. Now, the thing that I'm a little bit on the fence about here is that the WNBA, sometimes because of their own making, other times not, they are not the most proactive about caretaking their own history properly. And we saw this with Candace Parker this year, in the last 2 years. She didn't want a farewell tour. She just kind of retired quietly. And what ended up happening was the expectation was the league is going to do something for her. The league is going to do something for Simone Augustus, the LSU legend and multi-time WNBA champion, as well as Sue Bird when Sue retires. And we don't get all of those things together. We don't get the farewell tour for Sylvia Fowles in the way that it needs to be. And so, as much as I don't want to put that on the players, it does feel like at times someone like a Diana Taurasi has to take the farewell tour so we still maintain history around this game and don't treat the last 20 years of women's basketball like it's, plumbers and nobodies until this recent generation of athletes came along. I think a part of that is, how we do the discourse online, but another part of that is the league's prerogative to story tell properly. And I don't really think they're going to miss the boat here with DT because this is like the one obvious, you can't screw this up. And no matter how, you have to actively try to mess this up this year. But I hope this is an instructive lesson for the W going into this coming season about how we honor and how the league honors its foundational figures and pieces so they don't get lost away with this entirely new generation of fans who we welcome and who we're excited, are here. But in the same way, we in NBA world take care to mention Big O, Magic, Bird, Isaiah, everyone that came pre-Jordan. We still talk about Clyde Drexler and Hakeem Olajuwon and Patrick Ewing. We still talk about Bron and Dirk and all of these guys that were around in the early 2000s, mid-2010s, Shaq, Kobe, etc. We need to start creating that culture within the WNBA. And so that's what makes me really curious about this, because it's really easy if a player does the farewell tour and you almost have to force the coverage into it because they're there. But when they're not there in the way Candace and Diana are not or have not been, what does the league do? And what do we do? And that's the big question that I'm iffy on, I don't want to push her, right? She deserves to retire however she wants.
Well, especially for somebody whose mark on the league is defined by her authenticity and the fact that she does not necessarily care for these types of things. And that generation of WNBA players is also cut from a different cloth in that way as well. It feels like when we started to get, the trickle down that this might be the end for Diana, it felt like the Phoenix Mercury, maybe the WNBA and Diana were trying to perhaps find a middle ground between the fact that Diana Taurasi, if she doesn't genuinely want to play and compete, she's not going to come back. She was never going to come back just to kind of be trotted around like a victory cigar, right? That's just not who she is. And she said in the Time story that, New Year's came around and she just decided that she just didn't have it this time around. She says that she feels full. She feels happy and full and just that she is done. And the If This Is It campaign felt like it was trying to kind of find a middle ground between making sure that if this was it, which we now know it was it, that she would be honored. And she had that final regular season game in Los Angeles as a Southern California kid, was able to be honored that way. Did a few interviews, and we all kind of had the sense watching game 2 of the first round against the Minnesota Lynx that it might be her last game. Nafisa Collier, perhaps in an homage, talking some shit, saying, "I hope we send her home." Kind of channeling DT's spirit as well in that moment. So I think that was them trying to sort of, because you do want to let her do things her own way, right? This is someone that has always done things her own way, and that's actually a huge part of her story and what she means and what that generation of players mean to the WNBA too. Because look, she's 42 years old. She's 5 years older than Alicia Clark, who's now the oldest active player, which makes her the last player who was well into her teens before the conception of the WNBA. She is the last of an era of players who grew up dreaming of playing professional women's basketball before a league even existed, who had, the foresight and the imagination and the audacity to believe in something they could not yet see. And I was watching ESPN put out a tribute that Vanessa Bryant did, and it was beautiful. Everybody should go watch it. But one thing that she talked about was Taurasi, because there was no league, she grew up watching Kobe and imagining herself playing for the Lakers. That takes audacity, it takes vision, it takes a level of like this mix of self-delusion and self-belief. This like sort of, you can't tell me what to do or who to be or what my limits are, that I think embodies Diana and embodies that generation of WNBA players that you're talking about, this sort of bridge between the inception of the league and the Swoops and the Coopers and all of that, and like the second generation. I feel like they were really, defined by this audacity, I guess. And I think when you have that, you're also not necessarily going to be the type of person who wants all the fanfare that comes, like it almost self-selects in a way, right? Like if you were one of these players and you weren't getting into women's professional basketball because of the praise or the money, you had to love that shit, and you had to love it while there was also this cavalcade of people who were going to mock you and boo you. Like you really had to have a resolve and a love that existed intrinsically. So you weren't going to be the player that who wanted all the other stuff that came with it. I think that's just like part of it is definitely, to your point, it is, the WNBA is then responsible for stepping in and honoring you. But it also, I think we also have to just be okay with the fact that this is how DT did it. And hey, look, I think the Time story was a great way to do it. It was a great story. Everybody should go read it. And then there's also an ESPN story. It was kind of like an oral history as well of like kind of her biggest moments and everything. So I think that, as far as like the meta, how to honor a star in a moment like this, I do feel like the W is striking the right balance right now. And it just speaks to who she is. And I think it's so important because who she is so important to how she impacted the WNBA.
Well, and the crazy thing about that too is that because of the longevity, she inspired the likes of, Caitlin Clark and this next generation of players, because who's the person you identify the league with over the last 20 years? It's her, it's Candace, it's Maya, now it's Asia, it's been Stewie. But DT's been the through line through all of those people. And so as much as you can say, this player that dominated for a 5-year stretch or this player that dominated for a 5-year stretch, like Diana Taurasi's in the background like some smooth Argentinian jazz. Like she's just hanging in the backdrop and always is going to be incredible. And, it's interesting you mentioned this sort of shit-talking persona that is very unapologetic for what it is and who she is, right?
Before we get to that, I just want to add, like, I think just to put a pin in it.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about the GOAT stuff. Everybody's going to talk about the GOAT stuff. Beyond retiring without doing the retirement tour, she tells Sean Gregory, I have a resume. It's not up for me to grade it. I think that says everything. Like, she really doesn't care. She's so deeply detached from what the public thinks about her.
I also think too, I agree, because I also think too that is a person secure in their legacy too. That's like, you guys can decide it, because I know what I left. Like, if you were to put a gun to DT's head and be like, are you the GOAT? She'd be like, fuck yeah, I'm the GOAT, fuck all these other people. Like, but I feel
she
like,
believes that so strongly herself, though, that she's never going to care that what you think about it or what I think about it.
Well, and that's, to me, that is such a great singular legacy to leave for this next generation of players, especially in an era where, like, everyone's so online. And I know this is like such an old guy take right now, but like, I do feel within the world of basketball, men's and women's, I feel like we're at a place where the noise online is actually affecting the product itself. And,
completely.
We see it on the men's side in a very different way than we see it on the women's side, but we did see that, and we have seen it in past years where online discussion actually creeps its way into mainstream discourse and then gets to the players who then participate in the discourse themselves. DT never cared about any of that stuff. Like, DT would talk her shit to the press, she'd talk her shit to people, but I don't ever think Diana Taurasi gave me the impression that a fan could like shake her, or like a comment online could shake her. And I think that being cut from a different cloth that you mentioned, that to me is such a huge component of it, because there is this sort of single-mindedly Kobe Bryant-esque kind of mentality, you know, a Jordan mentality around what it takes to be successful in this. And to get back to the piece of her longevity, because that's there, that's always been there for this generation of players to emulate in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not everyone is going to look at Diana Taurasi as a young woman and say, that's who I want to be, but the competitiveness with which she plays is something that every coach is bound to show you at some level, be it, you know, youth, high school, AAU, or college. And then when you get to the pros, you just see her, right? So I think that to me is what is so cool about how long she's been able to have this career, is that like you can now draw straight lines to the competitiveness of Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark. And you can draw that to someone like a Diana Taurasi of this is partially her legacy here too. And yeah, like you mentioned, if you want to walk away at a time where you feel is best, I think that is completely fine. The historian in me is like,
yeah, and that's completely understandable.
Yeah, like I think my biggest concern in women's basketball right now, and it's a reason that, you know, we write our Legendarium series on No Cap Space, is because my imminent concern is not being able to talk to people while they're here and get the stories that are a layer below some of our biggest ones. DT's story is well known and people talk about DT plenty. So I'm not concerned about DT, for instance, being washed away. At the same time, I do think there needs to be some type of preservation of our history in there from a women's basketball perspective, where we don't 10 years from now be like, DT played a bunch of nobodies. DT did not play a bunch of nobodies. Like, for those around the early game, there is a legitimate argument to be made that the 97 talent that came into the league is at the star level as high as it is now. And you can make even the arguments that probably from about 78 on to about 1990, those stars in the 1980s in women's college basketball, the depth was different. There's better depth nowadays, but the top end star, Cheryl Miller would bust someone's ass today. You know, like Diana Taurasi of 2001 would bust people's ass if she was a freshman in college right now. And I think that's the thing that I want people to know more than anything is like, yes, DT was averaging 19 and not playing a lot of defense in her last couple of years or in the years where you may have arrived, but like DT was that one for a long, long time. And that's something that would never be ignored.
I do think, like, I'll speak for the new fans. As a newer fan, the fact that she did play this year, as much as I didn't get a sense of what she was like night in and night out in her prime, I got a sense of her personality and how little of, you know, fucks she gives about what people say about her, right? Like, I mean, you could even see it in all, like, the sort of, like, the Caitlin Clark controversy that sort of played out, and, like, the, you know, reality is coming and all of that. And we can go back and forth on like the logistics of what she actually said and didn't say. But the reality is that she said whatever she wanted in that moment. And she is doing whatever she wants in this moment. And that to me is like the through line that sticks out. So it gives you a sense of her personality. And then you think about the continuum that she's on. Like you mentioned the Cheryl Millers, like you think about like a player like, you know, Nancy Lieberman, Lisa Leslie, Candace Parker, Diana Taurasi, like they're all kind of on this like similar continuum of players who actually did capture the public's imagination and change the game in a way too, right? Like you want to make sure that all of that is captured. And you guys did a great story on that when we were like during the like I think it was some point during this off season as well. And you know, she exists on that continuum, and you see her influence all over the W, whether it's like, you know, Caitlin does an interview with Nike saying that her favorite matchup was Diana Taurasi because she was an icon in the sport, and you know, like because of her competitive spirit, which you see in her. You see the similarities in on-court expression just in terms of being a little bit of like a fuck around and find out type of player, but also the imagination aspect of it too, right? Like whether it's on the court with like the audacious things that they are both willing to try, the self-belief, but also like the things that they do off the court as well. Like, the Caitlin's decision to go to Iowa, for example, that is something that, ironically, even though like it was like doing the thing of like not making like the big school decision, doesn't feel like it's something in the ilk of Diana, but to me, it's just about somebody who had that same vision, the audacity of the vision, and then kind of willed herself onto a stage that couldn't have imagined her existence before her arrival. And like,
DT's like an American dream story too, when you think about it. Like Argentinian American immigrants, like did not come from money by any means, and built it up, especially for the W too, right? Like during her years, you'd go and play in Ekaterinburg in Russia because they were paying you $1 million to do it for 3 months, whereas the W was paying you $100K tops to be a max player. And so the thing that I think you're hitting on is like, it's just a love of ball, And I think like that is, to me, the line that like goes to Caitlin too, and goes to a bunch of these other players like Juju Watkins that's coming up right now. Like DT just fucking loves basketball, like on every level, just loves it. There is, like a Kevin Durant-ish type of way where to see basketball as an art form, that's what she interprets basketball as, or at least that is the perception that she gives. And in a time right now where I feel like
she could do her own version of like the detail show that Kobe did.
Oh, for sure. Easily.
And I'm so curious what her second act will be after she takes some time off too, because she does seem like somebody who, eats, sleeps, and breathes basketball. It's somebody who played for 20 years, who is the all-time leading scorer by 3,000 points, sheerly because of, her longevity and her desire to continue to play.
I'd be fascinated because I feel like the lane obviously is podcasting for everyone now, but I honestly feel like
she'd be the ultimate podcaster, by the way, because she doesn't give a shit.
You think, you think Draymond pop shit on, like DT would pop crazy shit. But like, what I think is interesting is that from like a TV media strategy brain standpoint here, I almost think like we don't need an inside the NBA analog in the W, but I think something along those lines would be helpful. And I feel like we're finally getting to a point where we are getting our generations of Chucks and Shaqs and Kennys. And I mean, you realistically, if you wanted to, if you're NBC or Amazon, you could put a dais together that's got Candace Parker and Diana Taurasi on it if you wanted to. Like, you want to talk.
Check in on the Candace Parker TNT. Is there exclusive rights there?
Yeah, like what is? I want to know. I want to know what that contract looks like, because she'd share that with me, obviously. But but like that feels like it would be the next stage of something for the W, is like a place for the legends to kind of like come and chat and do their thing, because I feel like they're all in ancillary places right now. Like, you'll see Swoops on some podcasts and then on some shows. You'll see Lisa Leslie on, Big Three, and then she's doing Unrivaled, and then she's on Angel's podcast, right? Like, you see Nancy Lieberman and a bunch of different things. Like, there's not a singular appointment place where we want to go to see them and hear them, because podcasts are nebulous too in that respect. And I feel like the W can get that.
With like a regular guest spot on A Touch More with Sue Bird and Megan Rapinoe, and kind of see where it goes from there. And I get what you're saying with the inside the NBA of it all, but I also feel like with somebody like Diana, I'm not necessarily I think the levity and the silliness will come from just the fact that she is Diana, but I want her like analyzing hoops,
True.
Like I want her talking about the game in like a high level intellectual way. That's the vehicle for Diana Taurasi, in my opinion.
Omaha Productions.
Cut that.
The Diana cast.
The Ringer.
Yes, the Ringer.
Introducing your next Ringer podcast.
Bro, this is right up Bill's alley. Are you kidding me? Like, First Doc Rivers and now Diana Taurasi. This is exactly the feel.
So the other player that I find myself thinking of right now as I think about Diana and, you know, just her legacy and the people who will kind of be her torchbearers is Courtney Williams. Like when I think about the bravado and the towing the line between cocky and confident and how she captured the imagination of everybody watching the finals, you could feel her competitiveness, but you could also feel this sort of devilish exuberance that sort of like just spools out of her body, this like authenticity, this comfort, like just a comfort in her own skin and just like this fuck around and find out energy. Like they both really embody this. And it got me thinking too, especially going back and today, you know, we really only had like an hour and a half to prep for this, but just going back and watching some old footage and seeing, you know, Diana Taurasi with her hair down, wearing a skirt, wearing heels, like you can also measure the evolution of queer self-expression and authenticity in the WNBA through the style evolution of Diana Taurasi. And self-expression in general in the way that she behaved on and off the court, which again is why I think the authenticity piece of who Diana is so important to the story of what she meant to the W.
Totally. And you know, the important thing that I want to make sure is said in its totality here is you know, Diana's a component of that, but I think to have one of the biggest and most marketable stars in women's basketball kind of assuage your typical gender norms, to come out, to get married, to have kids, all of those things
at a time that was not normalized for the W. At a time when the W had, you know, kind of like a soft dress code and, you know, wanted its players to present themselves in a very particular heteronormative way. Like she was pushing against boundaries. So then now we have a league where, you know, you have sponsorships with androgynous brands. You have players
selling
who feel like they can be exactly. Yeah.
Well, and that to me is probably the coolest thing about how the W has evolved in that respect, right? Is that I would say like it was probably even more than a soft dress code. Like I wouldn't go as far as saying mandates, but there was certainly a conception about how the league wanted to present itself, especially in those early years. And to have a player, you know, when we're only 6-7 years into the league, start to almost orchestrate that turn and make it okay, not only for other players in the league to feel this way, but fans who identified in that way to feel that there was a comfort in the space itself. And I think so much of the defensiveness about what we've seen this year in the W is this worry that mainstreaming is going to take away some of what that first, you know, formative comfort was for communities that were otherwise marginalized in different places. And, you know, I think Diana is one, and there's others that have come along with her during that era that made such a massive difference that we see now. And to your point on Courtney Williams is exactly that type of player. I think the word that I'm looking for is like for a DT comp on the floor is like mischievous. Like if you're like if I think you might cause mischief. And mischief can be wide-ranging, as I'm sure we'll talk about, because like Diana's been mischievous on the court, but she's also had some funny mischievous moments off the court. And so if you have that like in you, that little like trollishness about you, Hannah Hidalgo is one, you know, speaking of progress, but in a very different way. But from a pure basketball perspective, she also kind of has that like mischief component to her. But Courtney is, I think, the good amalgamation of all of those various things that Diana's brought in terms of that progression on the floor and off the floor too. And like, dude, it's amazing how many different things she's touched in that respect. Like, we've gone from basketball all the way over to queer representation in the league. If that doesn't show the variance of how much she's been able to do for the W in that time, I mean, I don't know if you can get any more written out in fine print than that, you know?
Well, I asked you to bring your favorite on-court moment, but this dovetails perfectly with my favorite on-court moment, which was the moment that fused both of those things that we're talking about right now, which is the time in the 2013 WNBA Conference Finals where she squares up, goes toe to toe with Simone Augustus, who you mentioned earlier in the podcast. Their heads are right up against each other. They're bumping up against each other defensively. A technical foul is about to be called. Perhaps it could have been called. And right at the height of the conflict, where it feels like everything is coming to a head, Diana just gives her a little kiss on the cheek. And I think to be able to just, while the tension is ratcheted up to that level, to still be able to maintain a level of levity and humor and just diffuse the moment with that was so perfectly what I have come to learn about Diana Taurasi. And she says after the game, we were just trying to make sweet love. That's about it. And hey, it makes, because for Diana Taurasi, I feel like competition is the highest form of love. Like, to her, there's like a challengers-esque thing going on in that moment.
What's so funny is that, like, she melds those two a lot and has over the course of her career, where she's melded like the off-court mischief with on-court performance. Mine are a little more split up. I would say the game 2 of the 2007 finals against the Detroit Shock was, to me, a pivotal moment for Diana Taurasi establishing her greatness in the league. 30 points, 7 to 14 on three-point shooting. But I also think it was a pretty seminal moment, and that series was a seminal moment for the direction of the league. Up until that point, you did have you had a fun and relatively loose, offensive style at times within the W. The Houston Comets and Van Chancellor's team were a big piece of that. But for the most part, it was a lot of kind of Tennessee ball in that sense. Pat Summitt, SEC-inspired defensive play. And the Detroit Shock with Swing Cash and Bill Laimbeer as their coach played in a very 80s Pistons type of way, It wasn't necessarily the most aesthetically pleasing basketball. And even if it was incredible defensive ball, narratively, you have a hard time trying to sell good defensive basketball when you're also trying to climb the hump of, the women's basketball component if you're selling to casuals, right? And that 07 team has got Cappy Pondexter, it's got Diana, Paul Westhead as the coach, and it's just 7 seconds, shoot and go. I mean, it was wild how quickly they were able to score, how fast they would move the ball. And to me, it signaled a change in the league once they won that series. Not to mention the fact that it's just a huge game, right? In a best 3 of 5, if you go down 2-0, I mean, you're pretty cooked in this league. There's not a lot of 2-0 responses in WNBA Finals history. So to be able to draw at level and then go on to win, and then kind of bring forward this establishment of a looser, more open offensive game, I think is what ended up coming from that 07 finals and started paving the way for everything, that we are seeing now. It's always been, a good offensive league, I think, in a lot of ways. But DT was really a generational 3-level scorer that I think altered how people defended in this league, coaches defended in this league, and the type of players that coaches prized in this league. And that game was the one. The off-court memory is infamous. Infamous. The door. Okay. I'm sure you have seen the door, like the memes of the door. Yeah. All right. So allegedly after a playoff loss in Chicago, allegedly, Diana Taurasi punches a door. And
she breaks the door, doesn't she?
Yes. Like, it breaks the thing in full. Allegedly. And we never really hear about it. There's never really any discussion in the pressers about it. But some good Samaritan soul takes a picture of the fucking door. And, like, there's just a locker room picture of this broken door. And it becomes, like, WNBA Twitter's meme of the century. It's just like, you know how right now there's like the meme trend going on that's like, if I send you this picture, it means this.
Yeah.
That door meme would have gone triple platinum if it had happened this year. Like, it would have been the ultimate, like, if I send you this meme, it means I'm not coming out tonight. Like, some nonsense along those lines. But it just was in a funky way, just like classic DT, you know? All of the good and all of the bad for people.
Trotted that door out at their championship parade or something like that, right? See, if she had done a retirement tour, when she went back to, they could have given like all the fans little miniature like cardboard doors, like it would have been So I understand what you're mourning. My favorite off court moment, it's like not necessarily a favorite, but I think a moment that was probably very important that we don't like discuss that much in terms of what it means for the WNBA, more so with what it meant for Diana, but. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was discussed in these terms. But anyway, I'll get to it.
Okay.
Sitting out a season because the team that she played for in Russia asked her to. I think for a player of her stature and importance in the league to do that in her prime, it just shed a light on like the huge disparity between the WNBA and overseas salaries, where she was making 10x in Russia. So basically, like, you know, that was her main employer. Her primary employer asked her to do that, and she did it. And I think it just caused a lot of different ripple effects that we are still seeing to this day, because then you get the introduction of the prioritization rule in the WNBA CBA, which mandates that players will get fined or otherwise punished if they do not report to training camp on time because they were playing overseas, which then leads us to the creation of Unrivaled, because players like, whoa, we make way too much money overseas. This is what, you know, basically is actually our primary income. So we need something. So now we have Unrivaled as a result of that, and Unrivaled, who knows what the implications of Unrivaled will be for this new WNBA CBA. So I think like when we at some point like sit down and think about like the financial flashpoints in WNBA history, I don't think you can skip over that moment.
Yeah, that's a big one. And that is a discussion even still, you know, among players. Obviously, you know, the Russian league is not really much in existence, you know, to the American players' accessibility anymore. But there's still players that go abroad and play in the Turkish league. You know, there's still players that go abroad and play for Valencia and go win Eurobasket and come back. And I think while interesting and while it grows the game globally, I do worry, and I've always worried that, you know, how much does it dilute your league? And sometimes tough love is the best love. And I think that is what DT kind of preached in that scenario, was like, yeah, like this is going to make you look bad, but you might need to look bad if we are going to institute some type of change here.
I think this is something that has to be clear in the new CBA too. Like the WNBA, whatever comes out of this new CBA, it has to be the number one league for every women's basketball player. You cannot have, you know, the Gabby Williams situation anymore. You can't have the Emma Mieseman situation anymore. You can't have, you know, as we put a bow on this and talk about players who have not been honored in their retirement, you have Elena Deladon, who's not playing overseas, but has basically decided that she would rather, you know, live a life than
woodworking, as Shawnee said last night.
Right. Like, she's like, man, her IG, she is living her life right now. And part of that, I imagine, I don't know what her motivations are in life, but I imagine that for most people, you 4x her salary, maybe she's thinking a little bit differently, right? But that's a player whose potential retirement is hanging in the air right now because we just don't know what she is going to do. So she is, you know, like a lot of players in the past, not been honored in the way that she necessarily deserves. But I do think that, you know, the conversation around Diana Taurasi, how the Mercury handled it, the way that today was rolled out, it's progress. I think it's a step in the right direction.
What I appreciate about her is she didn't drop this at a time when the rest of the sport was getting coverage for something. Not dropping this.
A good time.
Yeah, like this is seriously, this is the perfect time. We're kind of in like a drain week right now. You know, we've got some good games, but all eyes are really on TCU, Baylor, and UCLA, USC on, you know, over the weekend. Then we have the conference tournaments, and that's going to take a little while because they're, the super conferences are like 16 or 18 teams deep. And then we get to, March Madness in mid-March. From there, we go to the draft, and then we start the season. She picked literally the 2-week span of the year where we can talk about this without it coming at the expense of anything or anybody else. That's cool.
Yeah, it was.
And I don't know if that was targeted, but that was cool of her to do that, because no shine is being taken away from anybody else this week. We can focus on this in the right way. And then, frankly, if the networks are smart about this, you transition that into, oh, and by the way, next generation, Lauren Betts and Juju Watkins this Saturday. Have fun.
Yeah.